So there's sometimes a propensity to think of the traditional martial arts as being unchanging. However, if we look at the true history, we can see that they've constantly been evolving and changing. That is the tradition. If we think of Gichin Funakoshi, widely regarded as the father of modern karate, and that term in itself suggests evolution, right? But he said that times change, the world changes, and martial arts must change too. We have Choji Miyagi, the founder of Goju-ryu, saying that karate must open itself up to criticism from other martial arts in order to learn what it can from those other martial arts as well. It's always been there. Every style that you can think of that's in existence today exists because somebody changed something. All the big players in karate's history have been innovators. However, sometimes we have this idea that things have not changed, and that's not the way it's worked. We know that, karate is a fusion of lots of different Chinese and Okinawan systems. It also changes when it comes to Japan. It has the gis, the belts, the do ethos added to it. It also changes when it comes to the West as well. And of course, the changes happen in both directions. Western culture has had an influence on the way the art is practiced too. The biggest influence is probably the do ethos. Kano, the founder of judo, realizing that martial arts were regarded as old-fashioned and not a fitting pursuit for Japanese youth, he added the do idea to his jiu-jitsu to produce judo. So this was going to be practiced as a form of physical exercise and character development. And the inspiration for this comes from what Kano saw was happening in the English education system, where sport was used for developing character and for developing strong minds and strong bodies. So there's been lots of change and innovation. Of course, that doesn't mean that all change is good. We need to differentiate between good change and bad change. So that's the next thing that I'd like to talk about. So not all change is good. We don't want change for change's sake. Now, ultimately, whether a change is good or bad will depend upon what your objective is. If the change moves you towards your objective, it's a good change. If it takes you away from that objective, it's a bad change. We can broadly categorize the changes that have happened to karate into two broad categories. The first would be changes that have been made for cultural reasons, to make it more appropriate for the people and the culture in which the art was being practiced. And then you've got changes designed to make it combatively more functional. So if we're talking about the cultural changes, the big change that we can all point to is the addition of the do ethos to karate. Now, ultimately, that idea was stolen from judo. And why that came is because, the martial arts at this point in history, the early 1900s, were regarded as being old-fashioned, not a fitting pursuit for Japanese youth. Kano sees this and he said, okay, this is no longer about defeating a guy on a battlefield. This is about developing strong minds and strong bodies, primarily to help build the military. Japan had found that its military wasn't able to compete with the modernized military of the West. So a cultural pressure was to produce strong recruits for the army, and therefore this do ethos, something that would develop strong people, strong young people for the military and for society, was regarded as a good thing. It was a change to make it more culturally appropriate. Now, obviously that continues. As I've talked about in other videos, as a Westerner living in Northern England, Japanese culture doesn't fit for the way things are done here. I understand that for some, they want to keep that because they're interested in Japanese culture. For me, I've been a little bit more selective. I've made changes based on what I feel is more appropriate. So the cultural changes are a little bit more subjective. However, the combative ones are more objective. We've always got the check of combative utility. That's easy to test. If something makes us combatively more functional, more practical, then it has to be a good change. If we look at karate's history, there's some strange bits of baggage it's picked up. An example of this would be 3- and 5-step sparring. I've talked about that before. These are very ineffective training methods. However, they are quite common in judo where they work. If you look at something like the Nagano kata of judo, you see these 3-step repeats. I'll unbalance him, and then I'll unbalance him and throw him. It makes sense for their form of practice. You also see something like 5-step practice in kendo. We'll move, 5 movements, again, to get used to distancing. It doesn't really work when transposed across to karate when we have these oizukis, because the timing and distance is so different from how we actually fight, right? So it's a cultural change that was made to make karate more like its contemporary art, to borrow practices from kendo and judo, and this cultural change was actually a negative change combatively. So again, this has always happened, and the great thing about the combative changes are they are objective. We can test them. Is this way of training, is this form of practice, does it work? Does it work against a non-compliant resisting enemy? So any changes along those lines, I would suggest as being good. And they're demonstrably good too. There's no arguing with it. If it makes you more effective, it can be shown to make you more effective. So I'd now like to look at why people are sometimes resistant to change, especially when we're talking about changes which are demonstrably beneficial to karate's function as a combative system. So we know that some people within the traditional circles are resistant to change, which is always a little bit odd to me. I mean, they often do it in the name of preserving the tradition. But when the tradition has been one of constant change and innovation, then you're actually breaking away from the tradition. I always liken it, if you think of like a movie, that's the way that karate has worked. It's been a constantly evolving story. But we do get these people who just want to preserve a freeze frame, a snapshot. They want to frame it and go, no, this is the important bit. But that's not the way that karate's worked. It has a past, it's got a present, it's got a future, it's going to continually evolve. So sometimes when people are resistant to change, it's often because they're not innovators themselves. So they feel that the need to preserve what they have in the belief that it's perfect. No martial art is perfect, nor will it ever be perfect. It has to change and evolve, just as Funakoshi and the other past masters told us. So one of the reasons that people give, and it's not a good reason, but they give a reason against change, is it's egotism. You know, you're being egotistical by thinking you know more than the past masters did. Now, this is problematic in several places, but one is the past masters didn't believe what they had done was perfect. They wanted it to continue to change and evolve, right? The other thing with it as well, it's ignoring what is actually happening. So if I make any changes to karate as I do it, I'm not throwing away everything that's came before me. That journey of 1,000 miles has still happened. What I'm trying to do is move it on an inch for the next generation who will also move it on that small distance. I'm not decrying what the past masters did, I'm building upon it. You think of any field of human study, like science or engineering, people get a good grounding in what came before, and then they try and move the field on. That's what we're supposed to do. That's how karate gets better. So if we refuse to take the baton that the past masters have handed us, if we refuse to kind of do our little place in the race of karate, we're letting the old masters down. It's not egotistical to make a change. Now, it can be. You do get some people, thankfully the minority of people who go, oh, I'm changing this because it's my new style. You know, I was a first dan, but I'm now a 10th dan, and I demand that everyone calls me Soke or Grandmaster, right? That's obviously negative and not what we're talking about. But being able to make these small, minor changes, because we don't have to start from scratch because of all the wonderful work that the prior generations have done, then it reaches us and we make these small, pragmatic changes to make it more functional combatively, and also, you know, to make it culturally appropriate too, to the times and the place in which we live. Those are changes that the past masters would have welcomed. It's not egotistical, because we're also acknowledging that it will change beyond us. We're not saying we have reached the perfect conclusion of karate, just as the past masters didn't. We're saying, you know, thank you for everything you've done for us. Thank you for this wonderful education you've given us. I want to move it on 1 inch. So I can pass it on to the next generations, and I know that they'll be able to improve on what we've done. There's no egotism there. We're just acknowledging that we are a link in this very, very important chain. We take what the past masters have given us, and we do what they wanted us to do with it. We move it on that small amount for the future generations, acknowledging that they'll do the same. This quote is often attributed to Isaac Newton, but it wasn't him, it was John of Salisbury. But when he said, if I can see so far, it's because I am as a dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants. The past masters and all that came before us, they're the giants. What we need to do is we don't start from the floor. We're the dwarf standing on their shoulders, so we can move it on that extra inch for the next generation to do the same. So the next thing we sometimes hear is that only masters are permitted to make change. What they're effectively doing there is making karate a closed shop, where, you know, don't think for yourself, don't have any ideas of your own, don't draw on your own experiences. This other guy will tell you all the changes that you need, right? And again, it just doesn't hold up. It's a logical fallacy. It's argument from authority. If anyone can suggest a change that would benefit to karate, we don't look at that change on the basis of who presented it. We'll look at the change itself. Will this objectively make karate better, whether it came from a master or a white belt? It's the value of the change itself that matters. I would also suggest that part of the education we should have received from those who've gone before is the ability to learn, to continue to learn, and to integrate changes and experiences back into the art itself. That's a part of what they're passing on to us, or should be. That ability to kind of move it forwards. And if we look at the history of karate, look at all the great names, your Motabus, your Miyagis, your Funakoshis, all of them were innovators. All of them were people who went, I can make a change. So if we wish to emulate the past masters, we don't do that by saying, I won't be like you. We don't do that by saying, I will slavishly follow you. They didn't do that. So they should have passed on to us the desire and the ability to make positive changes to the art. Now, we're not talking about free-for-all here, because the changes that we make can be objectively measured. Does this move us towards our goal? And if it does, then it's a good change and it should be made no matter where it came from. Now, obviously, the more experienced people are likely to suggest better changes. But that doesn't mean that we should absolve all of the karateka, the vast majority of them, 99.99% of them, from thinking. We should encourage people to be leaders, not followers. So if anyone has a good idea that they think will improve karate, float the idea, see if it has legs. And if that change can be shown to have positive benefits, then we should adopt that change, regardless of where it came from. So another barrier to change is the idea of styles, or preserving the style. If you look at the history, this isn't something that the old masters were keen on. An example is Gichin Funakoshi. He said, I have heard myself and my colleagues referred to as the Shotokan school. I strongly object to this attempt at classification. He went on to say that he thought all karate was one, and the idea of styles is something we need to get rid of if karate is to have a bright future. He wasn't alone in thinking like that either. Mabuni said that there are no styles of karate, only varying interpretations of its principles. If you look at the history, people were learning from different people in different areas, and then they would accumulate that together in their own teaching. They weren't trying to preserve what was passed on to them. So that's not the tradition. Again, the idea that things should never change is not what we're supposed to be doing. I think if you look at a tree, right, a living tree with healthy roots, the way you can tell those roots are healthy is that the tree will be growing. You'll see that new growth. The only tree that never changes is the dead tree. And ultimately what happens to that tree is it rots away to nothing. And that's what will happen to the lines of karate who go, no, we must keep this the same forever. They're making it dead. They're refusing to draw on the roots, what the roots are for. They're refusing to allow new growth, and ultimately it'll rot away to nothing. The styles aren't supposed to be prisons. They are jumping off points. They are points from which we go forwards and from which we progress. So the idea of preserving a style is not traditional, nor is it healthy. And the old masters acknowledge that to be such. Not a single one of the people we look back at and refer to masters or founders, none of them passed on the art exactly as it was taught to them. They all made changes in order to move the art forwards in a way that they thought was optimal. And we need to be doing the same. So this idea of preserving a style, the same, now and forever, it's an antithetical idea to the true history of karate. And I agree with Funakoshi. If karate is to have a bright future, we need to get past this idea of preserving the styles as ends in themselves. They are jumping off points. And what we're ultimately seeking is to make karate the best it can possibly be for the next generation, so they can continue the process that the old masters started. So the next one, unfortunately, is a really ugly one. It's not that widespread an idea, but sadly it is out there. I'm sure you may have came across it. But it's the idea that only those of a given nationality are permitted to make changes to karate, because any changes instigated by anyone of any other nationality is sure to be a negative change. There's a word for that. There's a word for those people who believe that a given group of people or a given nationality are superior to all others. It's racism. It's really ugly. There's no place for it anywhere. And that includes karate. I've had that leveled against me. You know, who is Iain to suggest changes to karate? You know, he doesn't speak Japanese and he's not Japanese. You know, had that this week. But it's a really ugly idea. It's also, apart from being really ugly and really stupid, it's also historically inaccurate. Jesse Enkamp made a really good video recently about how the roundhouse kick, the quintessential karate kick, how it had its origins in French savate. We talked earlier about how the Do idea, as judo expressed it, using physical pursuits for character development, that's an idea that Kano got from the education system of England. If you also look at things like the dominant form of karate competition today is the WKF format, right? That's a format recognised by the Olympic Committee. That's one that originated in Europe. If you look at modern karate training kit, punch bags and focus mitts, again, they're things that originated in the West. Karate belongs to everywhere, every nationality, all of humanity. And all of humanity has had a contribution to it. Right? It's not the sole preserve of a given nationality. So there are those out there who would put up that barrier, but it's a really ugly one. And aside from being detrimental to karate, and aside from being historically inaccurate, it's downright distasteful and ugly. There's no place for it. So karate has always changed and evolved, and it should continue to change and evolve. That evolution isn't a rejection of what came before, it's a fulfillment of what came before. You can think of it like parenting, right? If you're a good parent, you should ultimately give the child the skills they need to leave the home, to make their own way in the world. If the parent is known who must never leave me, that's not a good parent. And if the child, you know, is incapable of making their own way in the world, that's bad parenting. Or if the child just decides, no, I'm going to live in the basement forever, that's a lazy child. Something somewhere has gone wrong. Each generation should move karate on that little bit, because those who came before us gave us the skills to do that. I want to play my little part, my little contribution to karate. So those that learn from me can make further changes and innovations. I'm going to collect it all together. This is everything I have. The great stuff that was passed on to me that I didn't need to invent myself, because they gave me this. I've tweaked it a little bit and added these bits in. I think it makes it a little bit better, but you check. You see if you think it does. You know, and don't take my word to be the final word, and you make your own changes so that karate can have a healthy future. Evolution, change, innovation, growth are vital to anything to have a long-term future. And anyone who would decry that change, innovation and growth is denying karate a future. So let's get on with the task that we've been bequeathed. You know, let's work together to make the karate of the next generation even better than the karate that was passed on to us. That's how we ensure that karate has a strong future, that it'll never die out. It'll never go away. It's a wonderful thing, karate. I'm so grateful for it. My life would be entirely different without it. So I want to see it thrive and survive and help other people in the way that it's helped me. So that's the job that we've all got, to see karate continue to change and evolve and to have the brightest possible future.